AITA for putting my foot down and charging rent when my stepdad started trying to tell me what to do in my own house. So, I never expected to be in this position, but here we are. I'm 27 and I've been living on my own for a while now. It's not like I'm rich or anything, but I worked hard to make my space comfortable, a place I could unwind after work, have my friends over when I wanted, just exist without someone breathing down my neck. It was my home. My little sanctuary. That changed a few months ago when my mom and stepdad moved in. My mom is 52, and my stepdad is 55. They've been married for about 5 years, and honestly, I thought they were doing okay, or at least not doing that badly. I knew money was tight, but I didn't realize how serious things were until their house got foreclosed on. I didn't really hesitate to offer them a place to stay when it all came crashing down. They're my family, right? It felt like the right thing to do. And at first, it was fine. Awkward, sure, because they're not exactly the most self-aware house guests, but nothing catastrophic. My mom was trying to make herself helpful around the house, and my stepdad had this part-time job that at least got him out of the house sometimes. It wasn't perfect, but it was manageable. That lasted about 2 months, and then, well, things started to shift, and not in a good way. I took a 2-week vacation from work, which I'd been planning for a while. I didn't go anywhere extravagant, just some local day trips, hanging out with friends, spending time with my boyfriend, and just generally relaxing. It was my first real chance to decompress in a long time, and I was really looking forward to it. I wasn't expecting my own home to suddenly feel hostile. It started small, or at least it felt small at the time. The first time, I was heading out to meet some friends, wearing a pretty standard outfit for me, denim shorts and a tank top. Nothing scandalous, nothing that would turn heads in literally any public setting. But my stepdad saw me on my way out the door, and without even a hello or anything, he made a face and said something like, "Those shorts are too short. You should reconsider going out like that." It caught me completely off guard. I sort of laughed it off at first, but he doubled down. He kept saying I needed to dress more modestly, that it wasn't appropriate, that I was making myself look cheap. We went back and forth for a bit, me trying to tell him it wasn't any of his business how I dressed, him refusing to back down, until I finally just left because I wasn't about to spend my day off arguing with someone who had apparently appointed himself the morality police. That moment should have just been a weird blip, a one-off comment from someone feeling out of place in a house that wasn't his. But it wasn't. It was the start of something much bigger. Over the next week, it escalated. Every time I left my room, there was a comment. If my shirt showed the tiniest bit of stomach, if my skirt didn't hit my knees, if I wore anything that wasn't practically a nun's habit, he had something to say. Sometimes it was muttered under his breath, sometimes it was a full-on lecture. It didn't matter how many times I told him to stop, he would promise to knock it off, then start again the next time he saw me. It was infuriating, but I tried to keep my cool for the sake of my mom. I kept telling myself they were in a rough spot. He was probably feeling emasculated from losing the house, maybe he was projecting his frustrations onto me because I was the only person under this roof he had any illusion of control over. None of that made it easier to live with, but it helped me bite my tongue, at least until the night my boyfriend came over. I've been dating my boyfriend for a while now. My mom's met him. My stepdad's met him. There's no drama there, or at least there wasn't before that night. He came over to hang out, nothing wild, just dinner and some Netflix. We were in my room for most of the evening, the door wasn't even locked or anything, and he left around 10:30 or 11, which in my book isn't exactly scandalous. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. As soon as my boyfriend was out the door, my stepdad completely lost his mind. He cornered me in the hallway and just unloaded. He was yelling about how it was inappropriate to have men over that late, how it was disgusting to be alone in my room with him, how we don't allow that kind of behavior in our house. And that's when I snapped. I didn't scream back, but my voice definitely wasn't calm when I told him that no, this wasn't our house. This was my house. I pay the mortgage. I pay the bills. This is my space, and I make the rules. If he didn't like that, he was free to leave. He didn't have much to say to that, other than some muttered grumbling about how I was disrespecting his authority and how he was only trying to protect the house's standards. As if he had any say in what those standards even were. That was the moment I knew things had to change. I went to my mom the next day and laid it all out for her. I told her I'd had enough of his unsolicited comments, his need to control what I wore, who I saw, what I did in my own house. I told her from this point forward, he was going to be paying rent, $400 a month, month to month, and if the inappropriate comments didn't stop immediately, they were both going to have to find somewhere else to live. At first, my mom was upset. I think it was less about the money and more about me drawing a hard line, something I don't think she was expecting. But I reminded her that she herself had said it was up to me and my stepdad to work this out, and this was me working it out. I also pointed out that they'd been living here rent-free for months, and it was starting to take a toll on me, financially and emotionally. Asking for rent wasn't unreasonable. In fact, it was more than fair. She didn't love it, but she calmed down. She's a practical person at the end of the day, and I think she understood where I was coming from, even if it stung a little. My stepdad, on the other hand, has been walking around with a permanent scowl ever since. He hasn't actually said anything to me about the rent or the new arrangement, but he's been giving me the cold shoulder whenever possible. Which, honestly, is fine by me. I'd rather have silence than his constant judgment. At this point, I don't know how much longer they'll be here, but I do know this, I'm done playing nice. This is my house, and I'm not going to be made to feel like a guest in my own space just because they're in a tough spot. If he can't get on board with that, then they can figure out somewhere else to go. I'm not his child, and he's not the king of my castle. And if he opens his mouth about my shorts again, he's going to find out just how little patience I have left. Update 1. At first, everything actually calmed down a bit. The house wasn't exactly pleasant, but it wasn't actively hostile either, which was the best I could have hoped for under the circumstances. My stepdad sulked around with a permanent sour expression plastered across his face, the kind of look that made it clear he thought he was the victim in all this. He didn't speak to me unless it was absolutely necessary, and honestly, I preferred it that way. Silence is a gift compared to the unsolicited opinions he used to spew every time I walked into a room. My mom, predictably, started trying to play peacemaker in her own way. She'd clean the kitchen before I could get to it, offer to cook dinner even though I'd been handling my own meals perfectly fine for years, just little things to smooth over the fact that the tension in the house was so thick you could cut it with a knife. It felt like her version of an apology without ever actually saying the words, and while it didn't undo the mess they had made, I took it as a minimal step in the right direction. If nothing else, it gave me some small hope that maybe, just maybe, she finally realized I wasn't bluffing when I laid down the rent and behavior rules. For a while, I let myself believe the worst of it was behind me. I was wrong. The day I found the letter, I wasn't even looking for trouble. I had been out running errands most of the morning, trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy after weeks of living in my own personal soap opera. When I came home, I tossed my keys on the kitchen counter like I always do, and that's when I saw it, a plain white envelope sitting right in the middle of the table, as if someone wanted to make absolutely sure I'd see it. I'm not proud of this, but my first thought was that it was something for me, some piece of junk mail or random notice that got shuffled into their things during the move. But when I picked it up and saw the name of the credit company stamped across the top, my stomach dropped. The envelope was already open, the folded letter inside practically spilling out like it was daring me to read it. I did. $15,000. That was the number, printed in bold type like it was no big deal. The letter was a reminder, a polite nudge from the company about upcoming payments, and right there in black and white was my address listed under my mom's name. My first reaction was confusion. How was this even possible? How had my address gotten tangled up in something I knew absolutely nothing about? It didn't take long to get the answer. When I confronted my mom, her first instinct was to dodge the way she always does when uncomfortable truths come knocking. She tried to laugh it off like it was some silly misunderstanding, said she must have forgotten to update the address after they moved in. But when I pressed, the dam cracked, and the whole ugly truth came spilling out. She had taken out the loan months ago, right after they lost the house. Apparently, it was one of those desperate, last-ditch efforts to juggle debts after everything spiraled out of control. It wasn't even enough to save anything, just enough to put a temporary patch over the gaping hole their finances had become. And when she filled out the paperwork, she listed my address. Not their old address, not a P.O. box, not even a friend's house, my address, the home she hadn't even moved into yet, the home I paid for entirely on my own. She did it because she knew, even then, that they were going to end up here, and she wanted the mail to follow her. She knew they were going to land on my doorstep, and rather than talk to me about it like an adult, she just quietly claimed a piece of my life for herself without so much as a warning. That alone would have been enough to make me furious, but it didn't stop there. When I asked her why she didn't tell me, why she thought it was okay to drag my address into her financial mess without so much as a heads up, she gave me the same tired speech I'd heard my whole life. It's temporary. We're family. Family helps each other out. And right there, sandwiched between her excuses, came the real reason she was telling me any of this at all, because, of course, she needed help with the payments. Not just this month's payment, but probably next month's too, and the month after that, and however long it took until they got back on their feet, if that day ever even came. That's when the last thread of my patience snapped. I told her, calmly but very clearly, that this was her mess to clean up. I didn't take out the loan. I didn't lose their house. I didn't gamble on some ridiculous financial Hail Mary that dragged my address and my home into it. They were adults, both of them well past the age where they could pretend they didn't know how consequences worked. And if she thought she could just guilt me into becoming their personal safety net, she was dead wrong. I told her, in no uncertain terms, that if this wasn't resolved immediately, if my address wasn't removed from every piece of paperwork they had, if I so much as saw one more envelope with their names on it in my mail pile, they could both pack their things and be out by the end of the week. There would be no negotiation. No more excuses. No more "we're family" manipulation. This was the first and last warning. Update 2. After that conversation about the loan, the atmosphere in the house curdled into something poisonous, thick and cloying, like spoiled milk left out in the sun. It was no longer just uncomfortable, it was actively suffocating. My stepdad stopped talking to me completely, which in theory should have been a relief, but the silence he left in his wake was even heavier than his constant judgment. It wasn't the silence of someone giving space or trying to avoid conflict. It was the silence of someone stewing, marinating in resentment, the kind of silence that felt like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. My mom wasn't much better. She walked around like a ghost, her eyes constantly darting away whenever I was in the same room, her mouth always twitching like she wanted to say something but couldn't quite decide if it was worth the effort. She started finding excuses to be out of the house whenever she could, even if it was just wandering aimlessly around the backyard or making up errands that didn't exist. When I did manage to corner her into conversation, she'd either fall back on nervous small talk or outright flee, like I was the one who had done something wrong and not the other way around. For a while, I thought that would be the worst of it, the Cold War, the unspoken tension that made every shared meal feel like a chore and every footstep down the hallway sound like a warning. I told myself they were just embarrassed, that the weight of their own mistakes was finally starting to settle on their shoulders, and this awkward, guilt-ridden silence was the best they could do. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something resembling progress. I could live with it. That illusion didn't last long. It started with small things, the kind of things that are easy to brush off when you're tired and stretched thin and trying to convince yourself you're not losing your mind. I would come back to my room after work and something would feel wrong, nothing obvious at first, just a vague sense of displacement, like the air itself was out of place. My makeup bag sitting a little too far to the left, the drawer of my bedside table cracked open just enough to notice, even though I could swear I closed it fully that morning. Little things that felt too minor to confront but too frequent to ignore. At first, I convinced myself I was just being paranoid, that I was projecting all my frustration and distrust onto inanimate objects. Living with people you don't trust can make you see ghosts where there are none, and I didn't want to be the person who spiraled into accusing everyone of invisible crimes. I told myself they wouldn't dare, not after everything that had already happened. They knew they were on thin ice, knew I wasn't bluffing, knew I was ready to throw them both out if they crossed the line again. They wouldn't be that stupid. I was wrong. The day I found the camera was so unremarkable, I almost missed it entirely. I was cleaning, just doing a quick sweep through my room, wiping down surfaces, fluffing my pillows, trying to make the space feel like mine again after weeks of it feeling like neutral ground. That's when I saw it, a tiny black dot tucked low near my bookshelf, so small it could have passed for a bit of dirt if I hadn't been standing directly in front of it. I stared at it for a solid minute, my brain refusing to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. I leaned in closer, brushing my fingertip across it, expecting it to be nothing, just a scuff or a weird imperfection in the wood. It wasn't. It was a camera, a miniature, low-grade, but very real camera, aimed directly into my room. My stomach turned in on itself so hard I almost gagged. There was no way to rationalize this, no way to twist it into something harmless. This wasn't a misunderstanding or an accident. Someone had put a camera in my room, in my house, without my knowledge or consent, and there were exactly 2 people who could have done it. I didn't waste time on theatrics. I walked straight into the living room, camera in hand, and put it down on the table in front of them without a word. There was no point in explaining, no need for accusations or demands. The evidence was right there, glaring up at all of us like a third party in the room. My stepdad barely had the decency to look embarrassed. He just muttered something under his breath, something about protecting the house, as if that was an acceptable excuse for planting surveillance equipment in his stepdaughter's private bedroom. And then, just like always, he twisted the knife, throwing in a comment about how this was ultimately my fault, that I was the one acting so frivolously, that my behavior had made it necessary for him to keep an eye on things. I didn't even argue. There was nothing left to say. Every shred of benefit of the doubt, every ounce of patience I had, every reluctant allowance I'd made for the sake of keeping peace, all of it evaporated in that moment. Whatever thin, brittle tether had kept them connected to my house, my life, my patience, it snapped clean in two. I told them, calmly but firmly, that they had 48 hours to be out. No negotiations, no discussions, no last-minute pleas for mercy. 48 hours to pack their things and leave my house for good, because there was no world in which I would ever feel safe or comfortable under the same roof as someone who thought spying on me was acceptable. My mom, predictably, tried to intervene, tried to talk me down, tried to frame it as a misunderstanding that could be talked through. She begged for time, for patience, for understanding, as if I hadn't already given them all 3 in quantities I couldn't afford. She pleaded and reasoned and cried, but none of it moved the needle even an inch. There were no options after that. Mom still tried to persuade me to give them time, but for me there were no options after that. Update 3. 3 months have passed since the day they walked out of my house with their hastily packed boxes and the awkward silence of 2 people who had burned their last bridge without even realizing they were holding the matches. The first week after they left felt surreal. I could walk into my own kitchen without tensing up, open my own front door without bracing for some passive-aggressive comment, sit in my living room without feeling like I was being watched or judged or slowly suffocated under the weight of someone else's expectations. At first, I honestly thought that was the end of the story. There was no grand explosion, no final confrontation, no dramatic plea to reconsider. Just a muted departure, like they were leaving a hotel they had bad Yelp reviews for, not the home they had tried to claim as their own. And I was fine with that. I didn't want apologies or explanations. I wanted my house back. My life back. My sense of safety back. And, slowly but surely, I started to feel all of those things returning. Then my mom got in touch. It wasn't immediate. A month passed without a word, which suited me just fine. I needed the distance, and frankly, I assumed they did too. It wasn't until week 5 or 6 that her name popped up in my messages, not with a long-winded apology or a desperate plea, but with something simple and practical. She wanted to let me know they had found a place. The story, in bits and pieces, came out through a handful of polite, almost mechanical exchanges over the following weeks. They had landed in a small apartment, a short-term rental through someone they knew, nothing fancy, just a roof and 4 walls and, crucially, no other relatives to latch onto. My mom had found a temporary job, nothing glamorous, but enough to cover rent and, as it turned out, most of the payments on that $15,000 loan she had so conveniently tied to my address. She never said it outright, but I could read between the lines well enough to know that she was the one holding everything together now, the one juggling work and bills and the relentless crawl of overdue balances finally coming due. He, on the other hand, had settled into yet another part-time job, the kind of inconsistent, low-effort gig that seemed to be his specialty. It wasn't enough to cover much of anything, but at least it was something. As much as I wanted to feel smug about that, about the man who once tried to police my clothes and my social life now relying on my mom to keep a roof over his head, all I really felt was tired. It was the same pattern I had seen my entire life, my mom picking up the pieces someone else shattered, turning herself inside out to hold a life together while the person who should have been her partner offered excuses instead of support. But, to my surprise, they were making it work, not perfectly, not without strain or struggle, but without dragging me into it. That, more than anything, felt like a shift I hadn't dared to hope for. For the first time, they weren't turning me into their safety net, their backup plan, their emergency fund disguised as family loyalty. They were doing it on their own, or at least as close to, on their own, as they were capable of. The messages my mom and I exchanged were cordial, distant, but not cold. She would send an update about work or a comment about the weather, and I would respond with something neutral but polite, a few sentences carefully balanced between interest and detachment. There was no warmth, no effortless familiarity, none of the ease that once defined our relationship before it had been stretched thin by her decisions and his presence. We were rebuilding from the wreckage, not with forgiveness, but with the quiet acknowledgement that we were both still here, both still standing, even if we were standing on opposite sides of a chasm we had dug together. I didn't miss the tension, the resentment, the constant dance of biting my tongue to keep the peace. What I did miss, in quieter moments, was my mom, the version of her that existed before all of this, before the foreclosure and the debts and the invasive surveillance in my own bedroom. The version of her that used to be my ally, before she became someone I had to defend myself against. I didn't know if we would ever get back to that place, or if there was even a place to get back to, but for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was carrying the weight of her choices on my shoulders. I didn't want them back in my house. I didn't want their problems creeping under my door like smoke. But if they could truly untangle themselves from the fantasies they once had, the family rules, and the belief that my adulthood was theirs to police, then maybe, just maybe, there was a version of the future where my mom and I could sit across a table from each other, not as mother and daughter bound by obligation, but as two adults who had made it through the wreckage, still standing, still willing to try. I had no desire to go back to that addiction, to the codependency masquerading as love or the constant expectation that I would fold myself into whatever shape they needed to survive. But if they could actually get out of this, not perfectly, not gracefully, but without dragging me down with them, then maybe my mom and I could meet again, not in despair or apology, but over a cup of coffee in a quiet place in some neutral place that neither of us owned. I wasn't ready yet, and I didn't know when I would be, but for the first time in a long time, I could imagine the possibility. That was enough for now.